Okay. Well, hi everyone. My name is Rich Vreeland. Thank you for your patience while we figured out the audio, which always seems to be the issue when trying to give a presentation online. So I've been making music and sound under the name Disasterpeace for the last 20 years or so. And here's a pretty good chunk of projects I've worked on: games, movies, TV shows, solo albums, short films, all sorts of stuff. And this game that this talk is about, it's a game where you explore a procedurally generated marsh, and you're catching critters like bees. And at the end of the day, you're sending them into the sky to turn them into stars and eventually constellations. And this game is a game of systems because it's an open world game. Um, we rely heavily on different systems to flesh out the experience. And honestly, I could give many talks about this game, but my aim is to cover a little bit of everything with this talk. The talk is called Paradise Marsh: Sonic Procedures for Open World Exploration. And so my goal is to try to showcase the most interesting things that we did and tried when it comes to music and sound. This game came out about 2 years ago, so it's been a little while, but I'm doing my best to recall all the all the good stuff that we explored. So I had just finished this other game, Solar Ash, which had taken 5 years to work on. It was a bit of a grind, and I was looking for something simple and fun to work on, and to just get back to the roots of what makes creating audio for a game fun and satisfying. And so on this project, I worked primarily with one developer. His name is Etienne Trudeau. He's from Quebec in Canada, and he had reached out to me because he wanted to use one of my songs in a trailer, and I said yes. And then I watched the trailer. Well, I watched the trailer and I thought this game is really cool. Maybe he would be interested in collaborating on the project with me. And so I offered to work on it, and he said yes. And so we started working on the game. We probably spent about 2 years working on it, all when all was said and done. And the first place that I started was by asking him for some footage, and this is basically the first crack at it that I had. So, questions about how to treat music in an open world exploration game. I took inspiration from my previous experience on Solar Ash, where working with the lead composer on that project, Troop Damage, we designed a kind of an open world exploration music system, and uh, wanted to design something with intermittent pacing for this game, where you can have these little moments where, like, for instance, you're playing and you found something like a message in a bottle, you have a little jingle or a piece of music, and then it goes back to this more ambient style that has lots of space, so let the ambience kind of fill in the gaps. And definitely there's definitely a strong Breath of the Wild inspiration, um, which also inspired the music system for Solar Ash. So it all kind of came together here. And this was a good first opportunity to discuss ideas with Eddie. Um, we basically decided this was overall the right direction. He vetoed a couple of the instrument choices that I was using here. There's like a drum and maybe one other thing that he wasn't super into, but a lot of the ideas that ultimately made it into the game, like the pacing, the creatures, like right here, you'll hear. It's really quick, but basically, having these little chirps that the creatures do that are musical, that sort of synchronize with with the gameplay and with the score. Um, so yeah, I mean, goals up front, having gone through that experience and talking with Eddie about what we wanted to do. I had a goal. I really wanted to try to synthesize all the sounds. Um, which I dabbled in that before, creating like creature sounds with synthesizers. And we'll get into that more. Another goal was sandbox as sandbox, like use the project as a sandbox. The game is a sandbox game, but basically think about it as a sandbox for designs, so both old and new designs, and relying heavily on systems, custom systems to basically help flesh out the experience. And then feature creep. So feature creep is this concept where you're trying to ship a game and you're trying to be disciplined about what features you are adding as you go, because if you keep adding features, ultimately you're going to slow down the development timeline, and before you know it, um, the game is taking way longer than you thought. But I sort of had this notion of why not explore features like feature creep by design, like on purpose. Basically, let the process be organic and just kind of dive in and see what's inspiring. And it was fun to do that, but in hindsight, it some of these goals created issues, which I'll talk about. But for now, let's look at this is the first trailer that I worked on. Yeah, so this trailer, all the sounds in it were created for the trailer. And I mean, sometimes trailers can distract from working on a game. Like you're trying to develop content for the game, and then you have to step aside and create a trailer. And maybe that trailer, because of the structure of the trailer, doesn't have a lot of overlap with the work that you have to do on the game itself. But from a sound perspective, I try to use the trailer as a playground and as an opportunity to create sounds for the game that haven't been created yet. And I try to use the trailer to define sonic goals that I have. So pretty much all the sounds in the trailer ended up in the game. For instance, the style of the music and sound carried over. The music in the trailer didn't make it into the game, but a lot of the sounds, like the say the patches and things, those found their way into other pieces of music. It may not have been the gameplay music, but there were cutscenes and things where I used the same instruments, which I figured out for this trailer. And then, there's synthesized sounds throughout. I mean, there's rain, wind, foley, creature calls, voiceover, star sounds, the monolith, which is the black kind of like obelisk, mysterious obelisk. Yeah, so I think taking that approach is really helpful and just kind of keeps things on track, and then it doesn't feel so much like a diversion. It can feel more like an important landmark along the way as far as figuring out what the sounds should be for a project. And with that, I want to start talking about music. So, as I was talking about a little bit with the first prototype, the loose timing and the slow pacing allow things to kind of breathe, feel natural. It makes it easier to transition into new moods when you have that sort of loose pacing. Helps the game breathe and just prevents the player from getting listener fatigue. So we knew that that was kind of the direction we wanted to go in. The first my first attempt at actually fleshing out a system for the game, I created a system that had 40 phrases, and each had an alternate night version. So that's 80 assets altogether. And then, I'm basically just playing those phrases intermittently. There's some variation in the playback. I mean, there might be, there's variability in how much time between the phrases. Sometimes the phrases might get played at a different key, so pitched up or down. But the phrases themselves stay the same. And this prototype proved to be a little repetitive for gameplay. Um, I did find a home for it eventually, which I'll touch on in a bit. But wanting more variety, I came up with a new approach that uses layers. And so this approach, basically each phrase contains three layers, and I'm going to play them, examples of them. So there's a baseline layer, there's a keyboard part, and then there's a more ambient pad type part. And so this was kind of the turning point, just figuring out that, oh, if we add a couple of layers to each phrase, there's quite a lot of things you can do with that. So this is the system that we ultimately used, and I went about fleshing it out. So this is kind of just a visual representation of how many sets of phrase, how many phrases there are in the game. I wrote two sets of 20 phrases, and then I did a third for the Lost Souls DLC, which we released about a year later. So altogether, 60 bass lines, 60 keyboard parts, 60 ambient pad parts. Those are 180 assets in total. And then each set, if you can think of this as three sets, each has its own scale, key, and instrumentation. So for the DLC, for instance, I use slightly different instruments. They each use a different scale, so they have a slightly different feel to them. One is Lydian, one is different variations of minor, and then I think the other is Mixolydian. I only made three because, first of all, each one of these sets it was a lot of work to build it, and just in the process of testing, it seemed like we didn't need any more than that. That was really enough because of all the variation that we could come up with, which I'm gonna talk about. These phrases are designed to work in different configurations, and you could think of this as mutations, or mimicking the differences that happen in nature. Um, at least that was kind of my high level thought about it in terms of just wanting the music to feel organic and it being a game about exploring a nature environment and catching creatures. I tried to lean into this idea of things feeling organic. And so what we do for mutating these phrases is we reorient the same elements along many different axes to create lots of variety. So here's like the same phrase, but I'm going to play it mutated in different ways. So here's the vanilla version, which is no mutations. Those are all playing at the same time. No, there's no changes or anything. This next version is adding changes to volume, panning, and timing. So I designed these. these layers in a way that they would work with each other even if they're not synchronized perfectly. Basically, just figuring out what sounded good enough that I could shift them around and it would still work. Finally, we add more sophisticated effects to create variation, things like pitch and the chance to reverse clips, filtering, reverb, and delay, and that's what this might sound like. And then finally, there's a percentage chance to mute certain layers. Um, it's actually controlled by gameplay state, which I'll talk about. I mean, so hopefully you can hear how you can get quite a lot of variety out of this system. I mean, it's only three assets, but because you're playing with all of these different axes, volume, panning, timing, pitch, reverse, filtering, reverb, echo, muting, there's like a lot of variability. And yeah, so the variation of these things happens in different ways. Some of these axes would use randomness to create variation. Um, and then, others use game state, and many use both. For instance, if I'm looking at the stars in the game, so when you look up at the stars when you're uh, talking to the creatures that you've collected, or you're planning to try to draw a constellation and basically finalize the constellation. So there's a whole shift that happens when you look up, and part of that is the pitch of the music files is changed. Um, so that's just a straight game state change, a game state reaction. But the system also flips a coin, which is obviously like a random thing, and it just to flips a coin to decide whether it's going to shift the music up 1.5 octaves or 2 octaves. And there's lots of examples of this kind of behavior where the music is reacting to changes in game state, but there's also some randomness just to keep things fresh. Now, if we zoom out from this context of talking about the layers of the music, music is also being modulated at a global level. So this is just a crude diagram of, the actual time it takes between phrases to play is variable. And this relies on, a combination of manual padding of time, like, oh, we're gonna make sure that there's at least this much time between every phrase. But then there's also randomness in ranges to say, it can play between 1 and 2 seconds, so it could play 1.3 seconds later or 1.7 seconds. And then also game state, depending on the context, there may or may not be more or less time. For instance, when you look at the stars, the music plays more rapidly. The pitch of the entire score is also drifting up and down slowly. Um, like about a semitone. So it's subtle enough that you probably wouldn't notice it. But the idea is that over a long playthrough, if the key of the music is slightly different, it will contribute to not triggering a player's brain and telling them, hey, this is repeating, this is the same thing. So I really tried to everything that I could think of to make the music not repetitive. I tried to explore and just subtle details to help keep things fresh. And all these mutation explorations were done in Unity and code. Uh, on this project, there were many times where I felt it was easier to do that than to make more assets. And to be honest, it was just fun to get into the scripts and experiment. Like, oh, well, what if I do this? What if I do that? And yeah, it was fun. This leads us into how the game state, how music relies on game state. So I'm calling that reactivity. Uh, and the music, it interacts with and responds to gameplay in a lot of different ways. Um, but for starters, let's talk about creatures. This is one of the creatures in the game. It's just a frog. The way music reacts to creatures is all about proximity. How far away are the creatures and in what direction. So, proximity to creatures is what drives the music. Um, the music helps you to echolocate. So, in the same way that you would have creatures making sounds like ribbit, frog sounds, the elements of the music are also coming from those same directions and attenuated in the same way. And so, the more creatures you have nearby, the more layers of music you have. But because it's a three-layer system, if there's four creatures and the fourth one is the furthest away, it's not going to affect the music because it's only you're only going to hear 1 to 3 layers. Like if there's only one creature near you, you're going to hear one element, and if there's two, you're going to hear two, and if there's three, you'll hear three. And as you collect creatures, they never come back, so that's part of the gameplay. So, so what if there's no creatures around? At this point in the design, you would say, "Oh, it's just silence." Uh, and so there's obviously some issues with that. If you're far along in collecting all the creatures, the game would become very, very quiet. And this was the way the game was for a little bit. And we had conversations about not wanting it to be that way. And it became clear that the game's music progression was missing a stage. Like it needed a final stage. Like as you get far along in the game, how is the music going to how is the music going to communicate that you're making progression and also communicate that, hey, this area that you're in is not, there aren't any creatures nearby, like it's empty. And so the solution for that were these phrases that we called empties. So this music that you're hearing is basically an individual layer that's been made really long, blurred out and stretched into an even more ambient version. And so I took all the individual layers from the game and I did this process, which is basically just coming up with a effects chain and rendering out all the assets again. And this was added late in development because we sort of realized later on in the process that we needed something else. And so, yeah, when no creatures are nearby, you'll hear a single blurred out layer. And this just keeps things active. It keeps the sound, the music going while commenting on the loneliness that there aren't any creatures nearby. And so the game still gets more lonely over time, but it feels a little less drastic than it did before. And it also helps because this style being different, it differentiates areas that have creatures and don't have creatures. So if you're paying attention, I mean, it's a cue to tell you, hey, there's no creatures around in this area. Like I need to go to another area if I'm looking to catch a creature. Now, also areas can be empty for different reasons. I mean, they could be empty because you caught all the creatures there, but also sometimes you're in an area where the creatures are all asleep and you have to wait because the creatures have different routines. Some creatures come out during the day and some come out at night. So these are all things that the hope was that this system would help to communicate. And so there's twice as many assets with this system, but I also found a way to reuse these assets in another context in the game, which I'll talk about. So it ended up being quite useful to have them. But for now, I'm going to talk about some other environmental factors when it comes to reactivity. So we have sort of the dichotomy of night and day in the game. Daytime uses the default settings, the settings I've been talking about, basically. But at night, you can hopefully hear that it's made to feel a little more mysterious. Um, The phrases are randomly pitched up a fifth or an octave. There's more echo. Things are quieter. And it's all meant to, add intrigue, mystery, disorient you slightly, and also to coincide with the gameplay. For instance, the monolith, which is where you have to go to send the creatures up to the sky, is only available at night. It's not, you can't interact with it during the day. Another dichotomy is sky and ground. So these are really important to gameplay. I mean, the ground is where you catch creatures, interact with things in the world. The sky is where it's where you basically manage your progression in the game. It's where you create the constellations, and once you've created all the constellations, you can basically head to the end game. So the marsh, the ground, it's grounded thematically. Like the music is meant to be more grounded. It's more dynamic. Um, I wouldn't say it's more dynamic, but the sky, by contrast, is meant to be more ethereal, magical. Um, there's more reverb. The pitch is going up an octave. The music is playing more frequently. All the layers play all the time, so it's much more like busy. There's a chance for things to reverse, and the volume and the panning are actually being manually controlled. They're just kind of swirling around you. They're not tied to anything. And so the idea with all of this is just um, to create a kind of an ethereal space that's a little more unfamiliar. It feels magical in some way. And this is one that came up late in development, the difference between moving and being idle. And so when you're moving about the game, the music system, the phrases, they're changing. But when you stay in place, um, the music stays the same, but with subtle differences. And this was kind of a late idea that I came up with. The idea was to kind of honor what the player is doing a little bit more. Like maybe a player, just wants to hang out. They don't want to run around and interact with everything all the time. And so this was added in the DLC, and basically how it works is it keeps playing the same phrase, but as long as you stay within a certain radius. But, the mutations continue. So every time you hear this phrase, it's different. That all those axes that I was talking about are being manipulated so that it keeps it feeling like there's some kind of evolution. Just let it play for a little bit so you can hear it. So this actually inspired me to make a second soundtrack album called Standstill. And basically, this album contains all the 180 phrases from the gameplay system, but they're laid out in repeating segments as if you were idling in the game. Because I thought this idea was so interesting of just having the same music, but just slightly changing it. So it was definitely just something that I thought was interesting and fun. And I can do an entire other talk about this album because I basically recreated the music system from the game in a DAW in order to make this album. So it was quite time intensive. But I want to talk about biomes now. So the biomes also have musical variation. So like the winter uses more filters. It's quieter. It's subtle, but it's kind of muted. Both the environmental sounds and the music are kind of muted when you're in the winter biome. Because, you know, if you've ever been in a winter environment with snow, I mean, the snow tends to absorb sound. So there's just kind of like a peacefulness to it. And that was my inspiration for that. And then we have the landfill. All the music in the landfill is reversed. And also the campfire biomes also has reversed music partially. And the idea here was to tie reversing things to maybe there being a stronger human influence, like something being slightly off. Um, and you know, there's a bunch of trash everywhere, so that seemed like a good reason for things to feel slightly off musically. One thing I will say is that like a lot of these things can be kind of subtle. Um, but hopefully you could tell a little bit that it's in reverse. Then there's the graveyard, which gets reverb on its music. And this is really tied to rain. So when it's raining, the music gets reverb on it. You know, when I go back and I was playing this game for this talk, I was wondering in a lot of cases, like, is the music too subtle? Like, did I make the music too subtle? Because I didn't want the music to be, I didn't want it to get tiring. So it's mixed, kind of quiet, which, you know, I'm still not sure about it. I think it has pros and cons. But the next type of reactivity is spacing and pacing. So, you know, there's many circumstances in the game where we don't want to have the exploration music system playing. You know, there are other gameplay features that have their own music. In the DLC, there's a radio that you find that plays songs. And so when that's happening, the exploration music stops playing because I would have had to make all the songs fit with the music system, and the music system is playing music in all these different keys, and it would have just been the nightmare to figure out. So it was much simpler to just say, okay, don't play any more phrases while you're walking around with this radio. Another example is eating a mushroom. The system pauses to make room for this, which is just a canned piece of music. And then this message in a bottle system. This is music from the first prototype. So this is, I mean, those are like my initial attempt at what the game should sound like, and they're not split out into layers, so they didn't have the same amount of reactivity. But I found that they worked really well for messages and bottles, and I would just split them up so that stanza by stanza you'd have a little piece of music play. And so this is just it's one system, the exploration system pausing to make room for another system, the message in a bottle system to play. And then one more example would be fishing. So one system stacks on another. So when you fish, there's percussion. And so, because the game had no percussion, I thought this was a great opportunity to include some. And because the music is so floaty and ambient, I felt like having drums over top of it, I could kind of get away with it. And so I was always looking for solutions that um, where I could kind of dance around problems, um, try not to over engineer things, although I did plenty of that on this project. Sometimes we don't want any music. So when the player's jumping, using an item like the net or near a monolith, those are all situations where the music system just doesn't play anything. And I came to those through trial and error. Sometimes they were just an idea of like, how can we break up the pacing? How can we reward the player for changing their behavior or taking a break? And so um, yeah, these are just some examples of conditions that tell the music system to take a break. So now I want to talk about diegesis. Diegesis is just a fancy word that basically means things that are in the world as opposed to like outside of the world commenting on the world. And so when you have music score, traditionally it's non-diegetic because it's not emanating from a location inside the environment. It's just placed on top. When you have diegetic sounds, the sound of creatures, those are diegetic. They're coming from the world. What's less common is to treat music as diegetic. And because there are creatures that are making music, it just made sense to explore having other props and things in the environment also be harmonious. And so things like drawing constellations, props like wind chimes and gravestones, which you can hit with your net, creature calls, like I mentioned. There's sort of like a clock system. Like there are these chimes that play on every hour, just to kind of help you. Um, it just kind of gives you a sense of um, how quickly the day is passing. And then this example is from visual effects, like twinkles. There are these like twinkles that are on lots of things. So it's subtle, but these twinkle sounds, they're pitched to match the music. So basically, there's a system that's figuring out what the current um, state of the music system is. Like, what's the current scale? What's the current key? And then apply that to these other sounds so that they're always in tune with the music. And so just all these kind of details, focusing on the sounds in the environment in this way, largely through systems, I think helped to make things feel natural and intelligent. So before I was talking about the empties, sort of the long stretched out ambient versions of the gameplay music, and this is where they came back. I needed main menu music, and I wasn't really sure where to look, but I knew that building things out in code on this project was a lot of fun, and repurposing ideas can save time, and so I just leaned into those assets that I'd made as as a thing to explore. So the main menu just basically repurposes those assets and the entire music system. There's basically like a clone of the music system that's slightly different. And then it just randomly picks 1 to 3 of these empty layers from a phrase to play at a time. And then there's some effects and, a chance to reverse things. And, the pacing is dialed in to be slightly different. Um, but then, I wanted to have like a concept for this and I wanted to ground it. And so I kind of imagined that you're on the ground looking up at the sky. And so, in order to kind of like add something that would make it a little more grounded, I added these crickets. Um, and I basically built a cricket generator, which just like it basically generates cricket sounds. Um, it's basically like a collection of crickets, and each cricket has its own deterministic properties about location, like where it is, how loud it is, where it's panned in the stereo field. what the pitch of that cricket is, how quickly it repeats itself, like the rate of repetition for the cricket chirps, um, and how frequently it takes a break. And then, there's also some uncontrolled randomness in there for variety, so that things are never quite exactly the same. And then you'll notice that like the music and the crickets are sort of like ebbing and flowing. Um, so they each kind of have their own time to shine. And I ended up recording an hour of this and putting it on the soundtrack. It theoretically goes on forever. It just because it's a procedural system, it's never the same. So um, you can just kind of leave it going. It never sound exactly the same. Okay, so that's music. Now let's talk about sound and ambience. So as I mentioned, I tried to synthesize everything. Um, Here's some examples of that. Skipping stones, howling wind, campfire, snow footsteps. And each one of these examples took a lot of effort, I have to say. Way more than I anticipated, and I'm going to come back to that thought. Let's talk about creatures. So, for some of the creatures, I tried to mimic their real life sounds. But then others had to be more symbolic because they didn't have a clear sound that I could think of. So I try to put their personality first, come up with a personality. The spider was like somewhere between maybe Boo from Super Mario 64 and the Shelob, the spider from Lord of the Rings. um, but either way, you might notice that these call sounds, they're all tonal and they could be played musically. So, I mean, here's like a quick demo that I just wrote up the other day just to give that example. Um, I initially just created a bunch of these generic creature calls that sound like this. I didn't really know. I was just kind of exploring, and it was good that I made them because they ended up staying in the game because I just ran out of time. Um, Unfortunately, I never got around to creating custom sets for every single creature. But yeah, it ended up being a kind of an asymmetrical approach in the sense that all the creatures have slightly different call behavior. Some use generic sounds, some reuse sounds, like the toad and the frog basically use the same sounds but just pitched differently. And the pacing of these calls can be different because their behaviors are different. And then I have a case study which I want to talk about, which is fireflies. So yeah, fireflies are an interesting case. They have their own kind of looping layer that's being manipulated in lots of different ways. They each have this looping droning sound. Um, it only activates when a player is nearby. Um, and Yeah, so when a player is nearby, it activates. And then the pitch glides through a pattern of musical intervals as the player's position changes relative to it. So, if you're facing this way or that way, it's going to move through different pitches in a scale. And then the glow amount of the firefly, if you noticed, it's kind of comes and goes. That's influencing the pitch and the volume of the sound. And so that's just like one instance where I had this opportunity to try to explore how to make a creature a little bit more interactive and interesting. And it was something fun to explore. And I think one of the themes of this talk, which I'll kind of touch on at the end, is just that um, these experiments don't always end up being worth the time, but it was fun to explore a lot of these things, and it was sort of like an education in, what's worth doing and what's not worth doing. And so another thing about the creature sounds is they can be different, whether they're for dialogue, like VO, or calls in the world. And so I created different sets for those. The VO versions are more human, and they're more bits, like meh, 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 like more piecemeal. Whereas the calls during gameplay tend to be longer, they're more musical in order to work with the score and, just kind of weave in. Okay, so environment. There's a lot of different environmental systems that we built. The first one I want to talk about is the vertex system. So this is a byproduct of solar ash. It's something I designed on that project. It's the most complex and expensive audio system in the game by far. And basically what it does is it intelligently attenuates the ambiances unique to each biome. And so you have these balls on the ground. These represent all the points that are being used to calculate how to attenuate layers of sound. So we have layers for the um, the water, the shoreline, and then the grass. Um, and so each one of these on the left, each one of these paragraphs is basically a different land. It's a different biome because at any one time you could be hearing multiple. Um, and yeah, so the terrain is generated using 3D Perlin noise. That was a design that Eddie came up with. And then so we created this lattice of vertices, these balls that you see over the land topography in order to kind of figure out how to do things. And so the geographic features of the terrain, in case you didn't notice, they're determined by height. So the higher the generated terrain is, it basically says if it's below this point, it's water. If it's above this point, it's land. And so the audio piggybacks off this idea too, and there are subsets of vertex data for water, coast, and the highland. Let's see. Um, Calculation. So the volume attenuation is measured by distance to the closest vertex. And then the panning is calculated by measuring an angle between the 2 points that are like the widest in the field of view for the player, the most left and right from the camera. And then those are also weighted by distance so that the closer ones matter more, which helps with edge cases. For instance, if there's a vertex all the way to the left, but it's like super far, that's not going to affect the panning of what you would hear. And then as far as optimization, there was a problem, which is just that at one point this system was using 10% of the game's performance budget, which is a lot for audio in general, not let alone one single system. Um, but I have to say, this system, it made it so that it saved me a lot of time in the sense of like not having to hand place ambient audio assets just for the overall environment. Um, but yeah, it went through many versions trying to reduce the CPU usage, and then we ultimately landed on using this thing called spatial hash grids, which I was introduced to by Dan Reynolds, who works at Epic Games while working on a demo project for them called Lyra. And he had implemented something like this in the Matrix Awakens demo. Um, I knew I could build this myself, but that it would probably be better to get an actual programmer to do it. So I hired my colleague Charlie Huguenard, and he built it for us. And before the hash grid, basically the game would iterate over all of these vertices in each biome, which was quite a lot. And that would be despite the fact that many of those vertices are too far away to matter. So it was wasteful. And in order to reduce that, the spatial hash grid breaks up the biome into chunks. And the system would now only iterate through chunks that are nearby. And that saved us a lot of CPU cycles. The next I want to talk about trees. Um, so trees have this funky thing where each tree has two sounds. And depending on where you are, it crossfades between the two. And it's another one of these things that's pretty subtle. And so in hindsight, I wonder, like, was this worth the effort, or did I not like the sound selection maybe not good enough? But basically each tree, I'll play it again. Each tree emits two mono sound sources, and then the output is the crossfade of those two. And it's determined by your position. So like where your position is around the tree, it'll crossfade between those two. So if you're on the north side of the tree, you might hear 100% of sound A and 0% of sound B. Or if you're like straight east or west, you might hear 50% of both. Um, but yeah, this is one of those things where I'm thinking like, does anyone even notice this? It might be more sophisticated than necessary, and I think it's a good example of why playtesting can be useful. But at the same time, sometimes, especially in audio, things that go unnoticed might be working well. So it can be hard to tell like whether or not it's you've kind of like over-engineered something. But this is another tree system that's much more obvious. Um, so this is a special biome for the DLC called the Spirit Forest. It's this huge canopy of trees that are mysterious and hard to find. And so there's two primary elements. There's these drones, and then there are these like little call and response sounds, those are more subtle. But the drones you're hearing, they're actually from an old experiment that I did for Solar Ash, where each tree generates a tone, and then your position relative to each tree trunk alters its pitch along a scale. And then there's portamento, which is basically just means the pitch slides between the notes. And then there's also the volume of those sounds of the drones is also controlled by how far away you are from each tree and whether or not you're looking at the tree. Um, the call and response system, there's a huge center tree and smaller trees around it. And so the idea was, why not have the big tree communicate with the small trees? So the big tree makes a sound, and then one of the outside trees responds to it. But it's really subtle. So I would consider that feature probably a failure, uh, unless somebody, is the kind of player who would sit in this environment for like an hour and just kind of listen. And, a part of me wanted to encourage that, but another part of me realizes that most people don't play games that way. So, but moving on, the next thing to talk about is storms. So I had this idea that came from a game I played as a kid. It's called Spelunks and the Caves of Mr. Pseudo. And I'll just play this video real quick. So basically, there's like you set the distance, and then it will calculate the delay and sound for the thunder. And so, I kind of use that as the basis of a system for storms for the thunder. So there's always like a random. We fabricate the location of the thunder. Basically, say, okay, the lightning strike is going in that direction, and then we'll add some amount of delay to kind of like simulate that. Um, and that was because the lightning was a global shader, and so it couldn't be pinpointed to a certain location, so we had to bake in. And then, the more delay there is, the more attenuation, like the quieter the sound would be. And it's all calculated using the speed of sound, or mimicking the speed of sound. When I listen to this demo now, I'm like, oh wow, the thunder should be way louder. But again, it's another case where things are maybe too subtle. I also never got to design any actual sounds for this system. I was just kind of running around and working on everything that I could think of. And so I built a system and I never actually replaced the temp sounds that Eddie had created. Um, Another thing I want to touch on with the storms is the rain. So the rain, I'm going to play this again. The rain uses the vertex system to attenuate itself. And so there's two layers of rain. There's rain on water and there's rain on land, and they're slightly different. I tried to kind of recreate the sound. So these are just little details that I thought would just add to the immersion. Um, let's talk about foliage. So this is pretty straightforward. Generates audio when you move through leafy collisionless objects. So it uses the player's speed to modulate pitch and volume of a looping sound. And so this happens when the player is like within a collider, typically a sphere or a box. And then when you exit, the sound stays in the last known position so that as you move away from it, it attenuates, it gets quieter and it pans. And so that kind of adds a little bit of realism as you kind of move through all these different objects. And there's one other kind of foliage in the game, which is called the outro. So the outro is a sort of musical experience. Um, and then these little balls. So these are actually tuned to the music. This music is a track, so it has a linear progression. So in order to figure out how to make those bits of foliage musical, we built a system that would reference the sample position of the song and say, okay, if it's between these sample positions in the song, use this scale. If it's between these sample positions, use that scale. And this way, it's always picking the correct notes to kind of match the music. There's also different kinds of wind systems. There's global wind, which was kind of a late add. One of the videos earlier, if you go back to the in the talk, there's a global wind parameter, and it kind of shows you like this value that's kind of ebbing and flowing between a certain range. And the idea is, what if we could alter the intensity of the wind across all the systems of the game, not just audio, and it would allow everything to respond organically. So we generate a global 0 to 1 value using a simplex waveform. Kind of looks like that. And then we have properties such as minimum and maximum amplitude and frequency, and just create this like sense of fluctuation. And the signature of the wind changes periodically throughout each in-game day. Um, and this sort of impacts the VFX and the audio, like the crossfading of the tree system. The shaders for trees and leafy objects are driven by this wind, which kind of just, it tells it how much it needs to move back and forth. Um, Another very subtle feature. And then there's ear wind, which is wind passing by the player's ears. This was something that I was inspired to try from having taken, the ferry when I was a kid, getting on a boat and just feeling the wind kind of passing your ears, or if you're ever in a convertible or going fast on a bicycle. Um, it's only triggered by high speed movement, and then you have wind that's very stereo. It's very stereo. So just a little detail. Um, so the next thing I want to talk about is constellation drawing. So I'll play this first. Okay, so there's one shots. When you hover over the stars, you get a musical tone. And then the actual drawing um, uses these looping sounds, and there's a sequence. There's a repeatable sequence to help you keep track of, where you're going. And this whole sound design for this mechanic was inspired by The Witness, which is a puzzle game from probably like 10 years ago, maybe a little longer. They had these environmental puzzles that were on a huge scale where you would draw lines across large bits of the environment, and they had this really powerful sound to them. And so I knew that something like that would probably be nice for something like this, where you're manipulating stars. To just the idea was, to try to make it powerful. Um, and I used linear. I basically loaded this up in a DAW and just recorded linearly, which was really necessary because there's so many elements to this design. Because the system has to account for, like, if fail state, if you're holding a star, if you're letting go. There's like quite a lot of variation in the states. So it took a lot of time to actually implement this. But scoring it to video was very helpful. There's also subtle details in here where the more successive stars you draw that are wrong, the pitch starts to get more and more incorrect, and it starts to sound more and more off. So yeah, that's environment, and now we can move on to props. So monoliths, as I mentioned, are these sort of like ancient, mysterious pillars, and they allow you to send creatures that you collect back into the sky, unlocking stars. And so here's some footage of that. I wanted it to stand out dramatically. So let's listen for a bit. So the goal was to make them feel ominous and uncanny by really differentiating them from the environment. Obviously, they sound different, but there's also behavioral things going on to help that. As you approach the monolith, other sounds in the environment duck out almost completely to make way for the sound of the monolith. It also ducks a lot less if you're facing the skinny side. If you're facing like the wide side, it ducks a lot, and then if you're facing this side, it you can't hear it as much, which was just an attempt to make it feel like it had some kind of technology to it. Um, it basically uses the same tech that the tree system uses with this sort of like alignment based system. The sound is comprised of different loops, which crossfade as you walk around it. I think there's like eight. It's a lot. The idea was just like to make it feel kind of like it evolved. The sound evolves as you move around it, and it's never quite the same. So it's definitely a very dynamic sound. And I came up with this algorithm that lets you crossfade between any number of sounds. It basically looks like this, if you were to plot it. 0 to 1 range where X is equal to 0 or 1, it's designed so that it's like a barber pole, like it loops seamlessly, and you can just kind of loop forever, because as you go around the monolith, it's basically tracking a 0 to 1 value, and when you get to the end, it just goes back to 0. But there's no hiccup in the audio because of this. Um, Small fun feature, chimes. So this uses physics to figure out the magnitude of the impacts. And then each chime, there's different chime sets in the game, and they each have like a different sound profile. They might use different samples to be in a different octave, that kind of thing. They don't work quite as well as I wanted them to because they don't really respond to hitting each other. But it was just a fun thing to build, and it's of course it's musical in a way that it will tie it to the score as the score changes, like a lot of the other things in the environment. So my collaborator Eddie was always open to ideas. I could build and pitch something, even a gameplay feature, and this is one of the ones that I helped contribute to. I'm just gonna play this again real quick. So it's pretty subtle, but like when I was just taking footage, I wasn't even looking for this compass. I just happened to hear this clicky thing in the corner of my ear, and I was like, "What is that?" I was like, "Oh yeah, it's the compass." And so this term is borrowed from arcades, where arcades needed a way to attract players from afar. So they would do things like have flashy visuals or sound. Obviously, this is a very subtle sound, but in an organic environment, it stands out. Um, and then the compass is kind of broken, so the needle moves around wildly. The sound is basically broken up into these individual clicks, and the more speed there is, the more rotation speed there is, the more needle clicks play. Um, and the sound is actually borrowed from the fishing system. So I had this way of working where I would reuse pre-existing assets, pitch shift them, get into code, and it was a great way to explore sound ideas quickly. And it didn't require me to like leave the game and go into a DAW and start like designing. Like I could get into a different kind of rhythm. And to be fair, even like doing this in a DAW would be annoying to have to like place like 50 click sounds. But let me go back for a sec. Let me talk about the teleport. So I kind of glossed over that. So the idea for this was we had this eye closing thing when you quit the game, and I thought, what if? And we also had this teleport ability that was a debug thing for moving around the world, and it's something that I had made, and I realized it could be a fun mechanic. So I combined these two things, and then you can see there's like a chord chime when you teleport when you come to a new location. There's also a filter happening to the audio when the eyes close, and that's a custom filter that I built for the game. Then throw in a little bit of sound effects from the main menu, and it just kind of became a feature. And I built this on a separate branch, Git branch, which is what we used for version control for this game. And I just took a bunch of videos to try to pitch the idea, and Eddie really liked it, and he ended up including it and tying it to the compass. So that was like a really fun aside from the project. Okay, so that's music and sound and ambience, and now I'll talk a little bit about pipeline for the project. Um, there was no middleware, so most games like this would probably use something like Fmod or Wise, but I decided to do everything in Unity directly, which has pros and cons for sure. The pros is creating custom systems like we did a mixing system, object pooling. It was a really great learning experience for me. It was the first time I had the opportunity to really do that. Um, Object pooling was the first time. Mixing I'd done before, but it was a chance to really flesh out my thinking about those things. Object pooling, real quick, is just it's reusing pre-existing game objects for performance reasons. Um, so that was something that we kind of had to do because we didn't have middleware. But probably the best pro of rolling our own audio was I discovered this callback in Unity called on audio filter read, and it basically lets you create your own audio plugins really quickly. And since then, it's inspired me to make dozens of of audio effects, and it's kind of like it's been responsible for like a whole new hobby of mine just from this one project. So, I mean, I think that's a huge pro. Cons, um, I would say like it made it would have made mixing and object pooling especially way easier to have used the middleware. Um, having your own system for object pooling, it ended up being a bit of a hassle. It was a lot of overhead. It took months to find some of the bugs. Was fortunate to have Charlie, who also helped with the Vertex system, to help us optimize and kind of solidify the design because I had basically Eddie and I had built it, and not being like Unity experts, getting into something like object pooling, it just it re required a lot of trial and error. So, as far as like just the decision to not use middleware, this had a lot to do with I was thinking about using Fmod, but it couldn't support some of the early niche experiments I was doing. I had this crazy experiment where every star in the sky had its own looping sound, and it would all be sort of modulating and doing crazy things as you moved your head around. And it just it didn't work. It didn't work. Ultimately, I mean, ultimately those experiments were failures anyway, but the middleware couldn't really support it. Um, so even though the experiment was a failure, by the time I could have said, "Oh, that's okay. I'll just use middleware and it won't matter." It was too late. I had already put too much time into this other path, and I didn't want to start over. So another pipeline thing that I want to talk about is mixing. So one problem is mixing without hearing is challenging. If you're not using middleware, you don't necessarily have access to the ability to play the game and mix at the same time. So I came up with a solution of live consoles. So basically, I used Unity data assets, which are usually designed for you to create like a bunch of variations of the same data asset, but I use them as if they were singletons. So each one of these is like it's a data asset that there's only one of. And so these all drive parameters in the game while the game is running. So I could tweak things while I played. I use it to mix the volume of systems, the vertex system, the trees, the wind, music volume. Like you can see there's a lot of different properties here that could be manipulated. And in general, I opted to go for data assets over putting values on prefabs for those of you who are familiar with Unity. And the reason I did that is because um, when you have prefab instances, there become multiple places where you can control a value from. And so that can be very confusing. And so if you force yourself to only have one place where you can put a value, it avoids room for error. It just avoids making mistakes. So that was the thinking there. The other aspect of mixing that we did on this project was to do additive mixing. And this was inspired by conversations I had with, once again, Dan Reynolds from Epic Games. Um, and the idea is just that if you have a lot of different systems that are wanting to adjust the mix of the audio, for instance, you have, a cutscene, menu, you have all these different things that want to say, hey, I want to turn the music down or whatever. Sometimes these systems are wanting to do things and they overlap. And so if you don't stack those changes, you can have issues with race conditions where they're both kind of starting and ending at different points, and you're getting weird zippering, weird results and volume changes. So in order to alleviate all that, I basically used a system that uses a dictionary to keep track of mix requests. So you can request simultaneously, two systems can say, hey, I want to change the music volume. And then they get added, the change requests get added up using decibels. So this one says, hey, I want to duck this system by 6 dB, and this one says, hey, I want to duck this by 6 dB. And in most cases, that works fine. Um, and In Unity, all audio volume is linear 0 to 1 float values, but you can convert it to decibels and then convert it back. So that's kind of what the system does. And also, it's important to mention that user volume controls are split out separately, so that they don't impact, in-game mixing kind of things. And then a big part of the pipeline was the HUD. So I having a comprehensive HUD is great aid in playtesting and debugging, and even more so in a procedurally generated world where, for instance, you have to find specific locations and it might take time to like discover things because they're randomly being spawned. So in order, yeah, being able to see the state of various systems at a glance, super helpful. Um, for instance, I could see how far the nearest monolith is, and I could see what direction it is, so I could get to one really quickly. That was like super important. This is a tool called Locator, which basically just you flag it on a prop and it will put a vertical line at that point in world space. And you can see these distance values and focus values. The focus is like how much you're looking at it, so that kind of helps with, oh, this is the one, like this is the one that I'm looking at currently. Um, and what's cool about this HUD too is that I had built this before the developer Eddie had a chance to do anything like it. So he ended up just folding his needs into the audio debug system, and so we just shared it. And he added skips and cheats, and we just had debug screens for all the different systems, which was really really helpful. And so, lastly, I'll talk about postmortem. You can see I scratched out post. So like a postmortem, if you haven't heard the term before, a postmortem is essentially when you finish a project, you review what you've done and you say, oh, these are the things that went well and these are the things that didn't go well. But I made a point to take notes while I was working on the game, and I like to call it a mortem, where I was just, while I was working, I was like, okay, these things are working well, these things are not working well. And so this is all this entire talk is from notes a lot of it is notes that I took while I was working on the game and immediately after. So first off, goals that I mentioned early on, how did these goals pan out? Well, synthesizing everything was a mixed bag. It definitely yielded a distinctive sound palette for the game. It was fun when it worked, but it was frustrating when I couldn't figure it out. Like, for instance, water sounds are really, really hard to do with synthesizers. It's really hard. Uh, it's challenging and time-consuming work. And this goal contributed greatly to me running out of time to make bespoke sounds for everything. No question. Using the sandbox as a sandbox for ideas. This was largely successful. I think we had a really good coverage of the features in the game. Even when there were bespoke sounds that were absent, for instance, the thunderstorms, there was still a robust system controlling how the sounds were played. I found homes for many ideas that I'd had from previous projects and things that I never explored before. And this goal really just it kept the project fun to work on throughout. And fortunately, Eddie was creating temp sounds for every feature that he was making as he was going. And some of them were not that bad. So that was fortunate given that I wasn't able to do all the sounds that I set out to do. The last goal, feature creep, this was also a mixed bag. I mean, it yielded um yeah, it's the same idea, right? It contributed to the game having a unique sound. But it also contributed to running out of time. So it's tricky. I think in hindsight I would have maybe done a little bit more planning and I would have been a little less I would have been a little more disciplined about what I worked on. I had a tendency to just kind of pick something random to work on because I thought it was fun. Whereas there were things that were very important that I really probably should have prioritized earlier in the project. Um, that being said, um, Eddie was adding features all the time. And so sometimes it was hard to keep up because he was quite prolific at adding features. I should also mention that I had my friend Akash the car do some sound design for me towards the end of the project, which was a big help in just minimizing the amount of sounds that went untouched. Okay, so beyond that, what went well? I think working primarily with a single collaborator is something that I have enjoyed in the past, and I enjoyed a lot on this project. It made communication and workflow very streamlined and easy. We basically just hung out on Discord while we worked. Um, I learned a lot about working in Unity, especially around using prefabs and debugging. Um, I learned a lot of new math for the project, things like the multi-crossfade. Um, and using decibels for mixing was definitely a kind of a breakthrough for me, making it very easy to increase and decrease multiple sounds together. And then getting outside help, with performance optimization, with sound design a little bit, like I mentioned. And lastly, creative reuse was a big theme in this project. So, the assets from the first prototype of the music system turning into the message in a bottle music system, the empties ambient sounds and unused the cricket sounds from the main menu were unused sounds that I had made already. So those all found homes or repeat usage. Things like the fireflies and the spirit forest trees, those shared the same sounds. There are lots of things like that, and that was just a way. Frankly, it was a way that I could sketch things out quickly. Uh, and there are lots of like unused, there are unused ideas, like I mentioned from Solar Ash, other projects. Sometimes there were synth sounds that I'd made already from other projects that I didn't use, and I found a home for them on this project too. So that was a big benefit. But what went not so well, I would say there are a lot of technical challenges. One of them was getting audio callbacks from animation and timelines. Um, that was a bit cumbersome. Doable, but it was definitely cumbersome. Um, and then even more specifically, trying to do any audio with shaders or VFX was quite challenging and very limited in what you could accomplish. Um, Another downside was just the amount of system work. It was a lot of boilerplate to have to, roll out our own pooling system. You know, we that helped reduce the performance costs, like I mentioned, but it was a bit complex to build and manage, and it took a lot of time to kind of get it under control. And I'm not even sure we uncovered all the bugs with that system. And then there are certain features that are just overly complicated, like using file names to auto load music data. So this is an example file name for a creature call, and so this means it's creature number 11. This means it's phrase 20. This is a hash set that gets converted to a scale, and this is the variation letter. Um, so yeah, I mean it works, but it's really obtuse. And it's illegible, and I could have just used a list of integers or something. Like I think at times I got too excited with engineering and I failed to resist the urge to, optimize too early and over-engineer things. Um, they're inconsistent organization. Um, Naming conventions. I was iterating on that over the course of the project. I didn't really have a strong plan for that, so it got really messy. I split assets up by type instead of feature, which ended up being very tedious. Um, yeah, I mean, those sorts of things kind of got in the way. And then I would say over ambition was a problem. uh, these are some spreadsheets and things of like things I was planning to do, and um, it was just impossible to make all the sounds required. I mean, I made this chart, and you could see done 12%. It's a little low. Um, so based on this chart, I mean, 40% of the game is temp sounds. So it's a miracle that it turned out as good as it did, knowing that. Um, there's also this struggle where, a lot of the systems were interdependent on each other. And so because of that, testing was really challenging. In fact, there's no way it's like almost impossible to do a test level, um, because everything is just interdependent. So a more decoupled system probably would have made things easier. Of course, when you decouple things, you have to write more code, uh, and I think it would have taken longer to build. But if we had planned it that way from the beginning, it might have made things a little easier, especially when it came to building out new features. What happened a lot is there'd be a new feature and I had to go find it in the game. Like I had to play the game and then go find the feature to work on it. And that's part of the reason why I built some of those tools like the locator, because I couldn't just like I mean, you could throw an object in, you could plop an object down near where you spawned, but there were other instances where there really was no way to do that because it was more of a systemic thing. Um, so that was definitely something that could have been better. Okay, this has been quite an extensive talk. I just want to give you some final thoughts here. Um, a lot of attention went into trying to make this world feel organic and help the player be attuned to what's happening around them. And I tried to do this through lots of subtleties. As I mentioned, sometimes things were maybe more subtle than I would have liked, but things like wind changing as you walk around a tree, the way it blows past your ears when you move extra fast. Each creature within the same species has slightly different sonic behavior. The sound of creatures is a bit different when it's far away. It reverberates. There's lots of examples like this. And in a vacuum, they're probably not noticeable. But my hope was that if I did enough of these things, it would accumulate and it would really heighten the sense of immersion for the game. But not all implementations end up being a good use of time. And sometimes these clever implementations go unnoticed. And sometimes unnoticed is good. Sometimes unnoticed means that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And sometimes it's bad because it was just a lot of work, for very little payoff. And the reason that sometimes it's unnoticed is good and sometimes it's bad, you ask like, do people notice? Like, was all that trouble that you went through, was it worth it if nobody notices? And honestly, I don't know. But I think a sanity test for any clever implementation idea that you have is like test it against a simple sound, like just play a sound or a loop and see if it makes a difference. Did they like your complicated system better or did they like the sound, the simple sound? But either way, like sometimes it's just fun to experiment with these different kinds of systems and see what you come up with, regardless of how it pans out. And so that concludes my talk. Thank you. I think we'll have some time for questions and answers.
Thank you for the talk. I have like around 2 to 3 questions, but before that, if anyone has a short question, they can ask. Okay, then I'll start. You have said um that you have basically tried to synthesize everything in game. Um, are the synthesizers like all in Unity and like oscillator based, or are there any samples
Yeah,
in the game, and
samples.
maybe you are only modulating the FX chain.
Yeah, so the modulation is effects. So mostly, yeah, filter, delay, reverb, volume, panning. The synthesizing of the sounds, what I mean by that is basically creating samples using synthesizers. So my goal was to create all of the sounds using synthesizers in a DAW and then render them out as files for the game. Synthesizing them in the actual game, like at runtime in the game, I mean that would be an order of magnitude more complicated, I think.
Well, a bird just flew by. Okay. So another part of it is um sound effects, and you have talked about coding some custom sound effects of your own in plug in Unity. Did you all just primarily use like your own scripts or some third party um Unity sound effect tools too?
Yeah. For specifically for Paradise Marsh, I think we only used two plugins, and one was a third party. I found a bit crusher because the game has, I forgot to talk about this actually. The game has it has levels of visual fidelity. You can set the visuals to be fine or like, pixely or chunky. And so depending on which one you choose, the audio gets bit crushed um, to kind of match it, uh, which was kind of a fun thing. But then there's this filter called molasses that I created that we use for the eyes closing. So it filters everything down.
Is it like a low pass filter?
Yeah, it's like a low pass filter. It's kind of like a gain. It's kind of like low pass and gain. It's sort of just like it's just an algorithm that I was just messing around and I came up with this algorithm and I was like, oh, this sounds cool. And so we used it. Yeah.
Cool. Um, Also you talked about like uh some proper or temporary um stuff for prototyping the soundscape when you were like not for the implementation but just coming with the sound of the game. Did you like do prop tracks in uh DAW and try to implement them in game, or did you like from scratch, no like audio prop track, just screwing around and did the um sound palette of the like biome tracks, for example, or the layers just from
Yeah.
zero come up within the Unity engine?
That's a good question. It really depended on the feature. Some features, like the music system, obviously I had to make all the layers in the DAW. So I part of part of vetting those was playing around with, you know, let me move them around a little bit. Let me explore how they sound when they're different. Um, there are features like, for instance, like the constellations that I mentioned. I scored that in a DAW from to video in order to make sure that I was thinking about all the sounds that I needed to write to make. Um, but then in that case, I went into code, into scripting in Unity, and I had to figure out all the edge cases that you could come across when you're doing the constellation drawing, because a lot of different things can happen. Um, there are a lot of features that I had an idea for that I knew were more technical, like the compass, also the fishing. When you fish, it also has this kind of ratchety sound. It's clicks, and the rate of click the basically it triggers more clicks when you throw the line. It's basically it's driven by the speed of the fishing line. And so when I had an idea like that, I knew that it would actually be hard to demo that in a DAW. Like imagine you have a sound that's made up of like, 200 clicks. Like to go into a DAW and place those clicks, um, in a useful way. I mean, you demo that? Yeah, I mean, you could use a synth, you could use some sort of like quantiz arpeggiator or something. It's possible. But
You would need to do it like algorithmically again, not by hand placing.
yeah, sometimes I felt that way. I felt like algorithmically was the way to go. Um, just as far as exploring. But I also, to be fair, this project for me was um, it was very experimental, and I had a lot of freedom to do things how I wanted to do them. And so I took the opportunity a lot of times to choose the educational path for myself over something that might have been more practical. It's not always going to be practical to say, I need to make this sound. Let me open up C sharp and like code together an implementation. That's not always the most like um, efficient way to start. Sometimes it's way more efficient to just take some game footage and make a sound in DAW, but um, at various stages of the project, I approached it differently. And earlier on in the project, I think I was more prone to coding things. Later on in the project, when I was feeling more pressure to finish things, I was more likely to use the DAW because I had to make a lot of sounds in a short period of time. So,
Yeah, because maybe at the start of the game the palette is like so empty.
yes,
The creative juice like
yes, the
calls
creative
for
juice.
more. I could do anything kind of mad scientist moment and later oh this has to be finished someday.
Exactly. Exactly.
But it seems to have influenced the like a conventional album release to in the style of like the album still stands. Like how did you implement those highly interactive stuff to a DAW? Like
Yes.
it's because it must be even harder, like with DAW being just a linear, like time-based domain.
Yeah, for sure. I needed to be able to use code. I needed a way to code that up. And so given the things that I was familiar with, one of the few things that I was familiar with in order to do that in a DAW was contact scripting. So I used contact scripting to recreate the systems. I recreated, the music system. I recreated the a system that would generate creature chirps and the environmental sounds. And everything, all of that stuff was able to be generated deterministically using MIDI input. So if I play, um, it was just based on the note, I believe. So, depending on which, oh no, not note, sorry, note and velocity. So depending on the note and the velocity, it would change, which clip you're playing, and um, the velocity would basically be the seed for a bunch of random generation. Like it would seed the, echo, reverse, timing, like all of these things were all seeded deterministically so that I could render out a version of the album. And then if there was a certain part that I didn't like, I could just go in and change the velocity of a single note, and that would recreate that phrase. Like it would play it differently. Um, so yeah, that was like a whole project that took a long time to build.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
So I have some questions too. First off, thank you so much for taking the time and giving us all this insight. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So I want to ask, how do you make sure the variations that you talked about go together despite having so much variation in them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the style of music is really important. Most styles of music cannot handle that amount of variation.
Yeah.
Mm. because it's ambient music, because the performances are very loose. Like even the version where like everything starts at the same time, that's still a pretty loose performance. And so I knew that I could kind of shift those around. The time shifting was kind of like that was like the thing that set off all the other variations because I knew that that was the most important thing for changing the feel. And then when you pull elements out, I mean that as long as all the layers are interesting on their own to some degree, it'll work. And then you know, pitch shifting stuff, that's super limited to, you know, intervals that make sense, like, you know, up an octave, up a fifth. Like it's very limited in order for that to work well. And so it really comes down to picking intelligent ranges of values that these things can be modified to, because you can't just leave it open to everything. Like, you know, the time shifting can only happen within a certain range, like a second or 2 seconds. And, you know, like I said, the pitch shifting can only go to like a few different options, things like that. So everything is controlled. Like it's random, but it's
Yeah.
controlled randomness, which is really important.
Especially for the time shifting one, like you have chord changes and stuff as well, right?
Mm.
So like I guess that you need to keep that in a certain range.
The chord changes are that's basically just when the system decides to move from one set of phrases to
Oh,
another. And so that just happens, you know, every phrase has rest between it. So there's always a natural pause. And the three sets of phrases, they're all in different keys that work with each other. Like you can go from any of those keys to any other one of those keys, and it will work. That's another reason why it was good to only have three, because the more of those I add, the more complicated it gets figuring out, oh, can I go from this, you know, C mixolydian to this like F whatever, you know, F sharp whatever to this thing? Like it would just get really complicated. So I ended up only having three, um, I called them vibes, um, which made it a little easier to navigate that particular thing.
yeah, thank you. Another question I have is um you have a very unique and complex sound system in this game, right? And so I want to ask what inspired you to make such a modular system? For instance, there are older games with s systems that have some variety, like for instance, in Ocarina of Time,
Mm,
the you have certain segments of music and they play at random so that it gets less repetitive. Or Minecraft, for instance, plays a certain music and then you have a large chunk of you know, no sound, no music.
yeah.
So maybe you have some specific examples of other games and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. Like I mentioned, Breath of the Wild was definitely a big
Yeah.
inspiration. You know, that has a lot of spacing and it plays these little phrases that are just a couple seconds long. And that's by far the biggest inspiration for going down this path. But that being said, you know, I've played a decent amount of open world games. I mean, I think about Red Dead Redemption is another game that does this for like exploration, where the music kind of like enters and exits. It's kind of sparse. And I just knew that I wanted to explore this kind of like sparse idea. Um, Other open world games have music that's more traditional, like it plays a track. But by having a phrase-based system, it's the system is a lot more dynamic. It can jump from one thing to another thing pretty quickly. Like it allows the system to be super responsive to what the player is doing while also being kind of mellow, which I think is a really nice combination.
Okay, so I want to ask another question, a more general one. What
Sure.
are some advantages of working with middleware to you?
I think um, The primary advantage that I think of is, well, there's two primary advantages. If you're working with other people, it's a shared piece of technology that other people may know how to use. It's likely that they'll understand how to use it, and so that can remove some of the friction. And then removing the friction is important to the second point, which is just that when you know how to use middleware, it can solve a lot of the technical issues that you have and just allow you to focus on making content. I think it's great for that, and I've used middleware in other projects. I think that for me, I have a tendency at times to want to build systems myself because I find it fun and interesting. Um, that being, I mean, I'm sure that like when I think about this system and like could I have built it in Fmod or something? I probably could have used Fmod, but I still would have had to do a lot of scripting myself in order to like prime it in the right way and give it the right information. Um, would that have saved me time? Probably. It probably would have saved me some time. Um, so I guess it really comes down to like um, what your goals are. Like, at this stage of my career, like, do I really want to like roll my own audio system every time I work on a game? Like, no. I'm working on a game right now. We just announced it. It's called Neverway, and we're using Fmod, and it's nice because I just sort of made a goal. I made a goal for myself where it's like I'm not really gonna worry so much about systems. I'm really just gonna focus on writing music. Um, and we are doing interactive music, and that's something that I can use a pre-existing tool for, and it'll get me most of the way there, even if it's maybe a little awkward to use because you didn't design it yourself, but that's most tools. So um, yeah, I don't have any issues with middleware at all. It was just a choice that I made on this particular project, I guess.
Thank you. And one more question, a more personal one, I guess. How
Sure.
did you start music and sound, and why did you choose to specialize in games?
So I I grew up in a musical household. My parents were involved in the music ministry at the church I went to, and then I um, started playing guitar. I was going on a different path. I was kind of going into graphic design, but I was getting really into music and making music while I was in high school and college. And so I ultimately decided to drop out and go to music school. I applied to music school. I already had a couple of albums of music that I'd written, and the games angle is just that I loved games as a kid growing up, and when I got into making music, I discovered that all these people were making video game inspired music, whether it was like remixes or using old video game hardware. And for me, I started doing remixes, and then I started like making chip tunes. Um, and that really opened things up for me as far as like it gave me an avenue to write where I didn't have to focus so much on the production of the music. I could just focus on the writing. And also the nostalgic component was like really fun for me as a kid. Just exploring these like retro game sounds. And so I kind of stumbled into actually working on games because the first opportunity I had to make music for a game was somebody I barely knew somebody who needed music for a game, and they connected us because they knew that I was making this same kind of music, MIDI files. So this is like very niche. And so I was probably 19 years old at the time, and I got the opportunity to write music for a couple of cell phone games, pre smartphone era cell phone games. And once I had the opportunity to get paid to make music and sound for something, that really was a light bulb moment for me. Like, this is what I want to do. I have to figure out how to be able to do this. And then I just put all my energy into building a career. And so that was, going to music school, doing live performance, having a strong internet presence, releasing albums, going to game conferences, events, just anything I could think of, I was doing it at that time.
Okay, thanks a ton.
Sure.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Do we still have time for questions or?
I don't mind if you guys don't. I don't mind.
Oh, thank you for so much for the presentation. First of all, it was great, and I really loved the fact that you go like in depth and gave examples from the game for each feature or um, each actually like crazy thing that you did in the game. Like,
Cool.
um, so my questions are a bit from the perspective of um, I guess, team dynamics and time and like project management way because I want to understand how did you guys fit in so many like such a complicated sound system in an indie game as because like you said, I think this game is developed by like you and one more developer, right?
We
Or
had someone writing, and we had a help here and there for various things, but for the most part, it was Eddie and I. Yeah.
yeah, I mean that sounds already like crazy. Like the amount of like detail in the sound system that you have described is like very triple A-esque
Hmm.
levels of detail. Like this the moment heard, oh, the chimes actually change depending on how fast they bump into each other. I was like, what is going on? This is like so detailed. And like when I look at other similar looking games
Hmm.
that have this like visual style, they often go like hard into having simplistic sounds and like mostly rely on one shots and then some variations here and there.
Yeah.
So how was the project like how did you guys fit that in? How long did you work on the project? And how was the overall project scope in terms of time? And where did you find the money to fund this thing? So
Good question. Yeah, so I'll start with the money thing. Uh, I mean, as far as I know, Eddie was kind of there wasn't any funding as far as I know. There wasn't much in the way of funding. I'm fortunate to be I'm 20 years into my career, so I have the flexibility to work on a project like this,
mhm.
and not expect to be paid up front. Um, uh, so yeah, it was a passion project for me. It was a passion
See.
project, and I worked on it for 2 years. Um, and I think when you have a small team, there are certain benefits to that in terms of how agile you can be. You don't need to go through any sort of approvals or meetings, very few meetings. When you work on a large game, there's a lot of meetings, and things are much more organized. This game was not organized. The code is like it's spaghetti code. It's crazy. And so we just had this mentality of just working fast and just hacking stuff together. And Eddie got really good at building features out really quickly. And I knew that I had to rely on systems, and reusable components to keep up and give the game enough coverage. So I really thought about the game as a painting. Like I need to make sure there's coverage for everything. Not that that's a unique idea. I mean, it's super common, the idea of coverage for audio, but leaning into the systems allowed the game to have a lot of dynamic audio very quickly. Like the Vertex system, I mean that's a huge deal. I mean, wherever you go in the game, there's dynamic sound around you. Like that goes a long way. Um, and between that and music, and then it got to a point where it became clear that this is the kind of game you could work on forever, and you would never quite get to where you wanted to get to because there's so many features. And so it became a matter of prioritizing the things that were the most important, So like I can remember towards the end of the project prioritizing the cutscenes and like, the character VO and the ending, like all these things needed to feel good, polished. I didn't really get into that stuff too much in this talk because those are more traditional. Uh,
Mhm.
but um, yeah, we didn't have a plan. I mean, I think when Eddie reached out to me, he thought the game would be done in like a couple months, and he was planning on just releasing it the way it was. And then I think I motivated him a little bit to make the game more complicated. Like I came to him with so much enthusiasm, and I think it became a more elaborate project at that point, and we just started kind of putting everything into the game that we could think of. Um, so I don't know if that answers your question, but
Absolutely. I
okay.
mean, the moment you said it's like passion project, I was like, oh, okay, then it's like absolutely understandable. If it's also like a passion project for Eddie, then I completely understand the direction you guys took because, like, as far as I see, like you didn't have like a publisher, so it was more like a creative outburst for both of from both of you. So that's I think like just very very nice and almost like an ideal dream scenario, like a match made in heaven kind of thing. That's so rare to hear that such complicated sound systems made in indie games. Like it is pretty rare,
Yeah,
but it turned out like a great example for such things. So I will definitely be referring to the both the game and how we approach to the creation of the sounds in my future projects, probably.
awesome.
But thank you so much for the insights.
Yeah, my pleasure. That's awesome. I look forward to seeing what you do.
Um, this is not much of a question, but one of the big points of the presentation was like the transparency and subtlety of many of the outcomes and if it was worth it. Like I think like in two ways um it could be worth it. One is like the game itself is a very contemplative game anyway, so it's I think the soundtrack is consistent within the game, so even it um wasn't maybe audible, like it's at least true to the idea itself. And one other thing is sometimes even though people don't notice they hear stuff, sometimes they subconsciously can feel it. And um I think like the it adds a lot to the world being natural. Like one other game that blew my mind to like that was played at Inside, and it's like
Mm,
a reference point that I tell to my music making friends, like that's like the best soundtrack of all time. Like
mhm.
I'm hyping over it, but although it has no music actually, and sometimes on this game too, like music and sound effects distinction kind of blurs together, like everything
Yeah.
is sound and a part of the whole oral experience. Anyways, I think they used Wise on
Yes.
inside, but like when I was playing it with headphones and this game too, I felt like I was in that place, like the whatever it is, the reverb or the variation. I think sometimes even more than the graphical side, although the visuals are and the VFX are stellar too, like makes me like transported and
Mm,
immersed in that place.
mm. Well, thank you for saying that. That's awesome. Yeah, yeah, Inside is amazing. The audio in that game is amazing. And there's moments in that game that I always point to as like kind of the the pinnacle or the goal of what I would love to be able to achieve. I always talk about the moment in the game where you're hiding, you've climbed a ladder and you're like hiding behind these plates and there's like this long field and
The
these like
shockwave section.
the shortwave, yeah, those like sound explosions that are coming at you. That moment always sticks with me as being like so where the music and the sound design are just like they're like the same. Um, and it's just such an immersive experience. Um, but
And
yeah,
that game
I'm glad.
has no like soundtrack release. So I had to like listen. Somebody recorded like just stood still in some parts of the game and recorded the game and made a mix of like sections. And that
Okay.
was like the unofficial album. I generally like listen to that for reference. And
Yeah,
like it shows
that's
that
cool.
like the soundtrack render like is impossible. You have to like
Mhm.
get into the game, and that's the music itself.
Yeah, I think I remember reading that Martin said that something along those lines. Yeah, like there's no soundtrack because, how would you even make a soundtrack for a game that's the sound is so interactive and dynamic? You basically have to pick one version of it to release, right? Unless you're going to release an interactive soundtrack or something, but I mean, you might as well just play the game at that point. Um, I mean, that's the reason I haven't released soundtracks for the mini series of games that I've worked on, Mini Metro, Mini Motorways. Like, I wouldn't even really know where to start with those. Um, with this one, there was at least like not everything is procedurally generated. And the things that are procedurally generated are at least like made up of linear phrases and things. So it seemed like if I was going to release a standalone soundtrack of a procedurally generated score, like this would be the project to do it on. And but it wasn't without a lot of challenge. It was very challenging to do that because it's only one version of what it could be because the variations are infinite. So you kind of have to wrap your head around that fact.
And like it's not a new concept, um like you could say, because like even from the 70s, like the video game as a medium is pretty new considering
Yeah.
all mediums. And like Brian Eno kind of
Hmm.
was trying stuff like that in the 70s, and
Hmm.
like setting systems and recording like 40 minutes because that's like a record length, and that's as much as I can do like stuff.
That's true. Yeah.
One um my last question would be like a more of a technical thing, but when you had said you didn't use like a middleware because like you had a specific effect in mind, and that, if I remember it correctly, was like when I'm turning stars make a pitch shifting sound. Um, what is it? Was that supposed to be like a Doppler effect or something else?
Um, n- Not like Doppler, more just like a really dynamic ambient music kind of chorus kind of thing, where every star has a different pitch and they're kind of fading in and out and panning based on your movement. And the technical reason why I wasn't working with Fmod, it had to do with like the movement, trying to synchronize the movement of the modulation of those sounds to the head, like movement of the head. It wasn't high enough fidelity because the head movement is happening on game thread. So it's, 60 frames a second or whatever. If you modulate audio at 60 frames a second, it's just not, it's too choppy. So the only way to do it was to use custom DSP that operates at the audio thread, like buffer rate, so that you can interpolate. You can basically take those values that are being sent to audio, like 60 frames a second, and you can interpolate them so that they're being sent, you know,
You smooth
way,
over the choppy points.
yeah,
I
smooth over the choppy points and send it at a much higher fidelity. Um, and so custom DSP for like middleware is entering into C++ land, and which is not a land I wanted to go to.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
but yeah,
Maybe the most you have went is context scripting. Like if you dive into C++, then you are basically programming the plugin yourself, right?
yeah. But in Unity, you can do C sharp, you can do DSP in C sharp. So for my purposes at the time, that felt like it was just going to be the easier path to explore these ideas. Um, because when I tried to implement them in Fmod without DSP, it wasn't working. So, but of course, ultimately, I didn't end up using the idea anyway, so it didn't really matter. But that contributed to it for sure.
Cool. Um,
I had a quick question if we still have time.
Sure.
I think you touched on this on the post-mortem bit part a bit, but like basically, how do you know if you're like when you are done with like a certain feature or maybe the soundtrack itself? Like, are you ever like, okay, I'm satisfied, this is what I envisioned, or are you like constantly tinkering until maybe the deadline or release?
Yeah, there's not a single answer for that. Every feature, like, there are features where it's like, okay, I this is my first pass at this, like my first attempt at making this good. And it might not be as good as I think it could be, but that doesn't mean that I have time to like keep working on it. Like I need to, or I might not have the energy or the enthusiasm to keep polishing it. There's so many things to do that I just am gonna move around and move to something else. So when I take a crack at something, you know, how much I like that thing, it's gonna vary. Sometimes it might be it's almost never 100% what I want it to be, but it might be like 98%, and that's great. Like I'm probably not going to touch that. Like, like the chimes, having not like they didn't have physics against themselves, which is something I wanted, but it wasn't important enough to take a ton of time to work on that because, fortunately, fortunately I realized that, it's such a small feature. There are so many other things that are more important. Whereas, maybe the music system would get more attention because it's an important feature. And so maybe my threshold for what constitutes being done would be higher. Like that would have to be closer to 100% for me, like, 95%, 98% before I would be comfortable moving on to something else. And then I would only come back to it if, I didn't have anything else to do um, uh, or maybe I would just say, hey, I think this is done. Like it's pretty close to what I think it can be. And if I don't have like a lot of ideas on how to improve this, then it's probably fine. But yeah, it's definitely not something that I can say definitively, like there's like a clear system for it, for knowing when something is done. For me, it boils down to intuition and like, you know, I basically approach a project from the mindset of let me play through the game and what stands out to me as being bad, like what needs to be better. And then I will just consistently approach those things and just keep trying to make the worst thing better until, until there's no more time or until nothing stands out as being bad or, um, especially on a project that has so many things, like so many features and things that needed sound. There was just always something standing out, like, oh, that needs to be better. And so, yeah, it wasn't really a case of like, is it done or not? It was always a case of like, I haven't even started this thing yet. So,
Right.
yeah,
Thank you so much.
sure.
one last thing I was curious about. Working with a project for so long, do you ever get like ear fatigue about the music? Like maybe it's tonally, even if it's totally interesting, like you are listening to the same thing for years or months, basically. Does it change your perception of the sound, or does it not change that much?
It definitely does. I mean, I definitely experienced that on a lot of things. I think the music in this game, because it's so varied, it didn't happen that often, but certainly when I was like writing the phrases, you can it's the same thing every time, right? So or any piece of music, if I am working on it for too long, I would get fatigued. And the only solution for that is to take a step back, take a step away from it, and give yourself a break. Um, so yeah, that's a super common phenomena. Um, the best way to avoid that is to not overwork yourself, I guess. Try to work in smaller chunks.
Yeah, keep taking healthy breaks and stuff.
Exactly.
Part of the process. Yeah. Um, if that's all oh, somebody unmuted themselves. Okay.
Yeah,
If it's
I have
yeah.
I have one more little question.
Sure.
A short one. What was your favorite game to have worked on, to have scored for?
Oh, probably mini. I always want to say mini Metro. Although this project was really fun. Mini Metro was another project where that was the first commercial game that I made that had procedural music. I had made a hobby project called January, which is procedural music, which is also up there because that was just my own idea for a game where you walk around and you lick snowflakes that fall from the sky and it generates music using probabilities like Markov chains. Um, it would be one of those, I think. Um, yeah, I don't know why, but I think there's something about those projects sometimes where it's more of a technical project. It just there's something really satisfying about the problem solving. Whereas writing music is fun, but it doesn't feel the same way. Um, it's just a totally different kind of experience.
Yeah,
Um,
I guess it's a really nice blend of engineering and artistry that you get to experience.
yeah, I think that's probably why it kind of scratches like both sides of my brain at the same time.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thanks a lot.
Sure, sure.
Well, I have two questions. Well,
Mhm.
before that, it was very cool presentation.
Thank you.
I almost left me no question to ask. I've been producing music for 5 years, and my group, my game making group, forced me to make sounds. So I have no idea about making sounds, and I've been using FL Studio for the whole time.
Mm.
Do you have any advice to use another studio, another DAW, or should I stay with FL Studio?
I don't think you have to change DAWs. Yeah, use what you know. I mean, FL Studio is totally capable of doing that kind of work. Um, I mean, if you have any other DAWs that you have messed with that you like, I mean, you could try because it's a different type of work than what you normally do because it's sound design and not music. I mean, you could try to use a different DAW and maybe that would be inspiring for you, but it's not a necessity. You don't have to. Um, at the end of the day, like all the DAWs can pretty much you can make great stuff with any of the DAWs. So it's more a matter of personal preference.
Thanks.
Hmm.
All right. Again, thanks so much for the presentation and effort and time you have
My
put into
pleasure.
it. And my friends and I would agree that like it was very enjoyable and
Awesome.
informative. Um, so and it's been like a pretty intense and long session. Um, So if nobody has any more questions, we can call it a wrap.
All right. Thank
All right.
you all. Hope you
Um,
enjoyed it.
yeah, thank you. I hope like in the next years, we'll be keeping in touch, and we'll be in touch about posting the recordings again. So
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
have a good day.
You too.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much for your time, Rich.
Yes, my pleasure.
Have a good one.
Good luck,
Best of luck
everybody.
in your future projects as well.
Likewise, likewise. Okay, everybody, take care.